Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, welcome back, man. Happy holidays, and how have you survived?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Doing really good and glad to be back. You know, as many people have probably forgotten what I sound like by now, but hopefully this will be the start of a new streak, and hopefully a streak for the better. Hopefully we'll be able to make many more of these shows going forward in 2017. That's going to be my New Year's resolution. Yeah.
And speaking of how we sound, I think we both sound a little bit terrible. It's right after the holidays. I've got
a cough. You've got a cold.
Yeah. So we'll apologize for that audio, for the robustness or lack of robustness of our voice today. But so we're doing it's what is it, December 26th or 27th, I guess. We're going to do two shows here to end the year, and we're going to do our normal end of year prediction show and wrap up show. We'll probably do that one tomorrow. Today we thought we would do. I was thinking back, because we're coming up on our 7th year. Next year will be our 7th year of doing the show, I think.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Holy
I think
shit.
we started in 2011. So next year will be our 7th year. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Yeah, that'll be 7th year. And, I was thinking back on it. When we got started, it was, for anybody who really remembers back then, it was the Two Guys in a Wire show when we first started. And it was all about kind of like converged infrastructure and private cloud and all that stuff. And we've never, ever really done a show completely about the public cloud. It's always had some weird variation of other stuff in it. So I thought we would sort of do a state of the public cloud, because it's a very, very real thing these days. So I thought we would do an entire show sort of, what is the state of the public cloud across a whole bunch of different stuff. So hopefully folks enjoyed this one.
Yep, absolutely. So let's kind of dig right into it. So this is, like you said, end of 2016. What is kind of in your eyes the general state of public cloud? Not just infrastructure as a service kind of public clouds, but all public clouds in general. And kind of, I have a bunch of thoughts here, but you go first.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those of us who came from a more infrastructure side of the world tend to make it very infrastructure centric. So I think there's a couple of big trends. Obviously, we're seeing maybe three, maybe a few more, but really sort of three mega clouds have emerged: Google, Amazon, and AWS. Obviously, not necessarily in that order. We've seen a lot of the SaaS providers, the Salesforces, the Workday, Oracle fits in that space, are really taking, Microsoft 365, or Office 365, kind of the business productivity stuff has moved to SaaS. And we're seeing a lot of kind of the emerging technologies that need scalability, need globalization, whether those are machine learning or IoT, are really just sort of in their infancy, but you can sort of see where they're emerging and how people are going to use them for their business. So I think number one, it's a huge reality, maybe much more so than it was in 10 and 11 when we got started. And I think we're starting to see where the big sort of strategic investments that people have made are starting to pay off.
Yeah, and so I think I've used this example on the show a couple times before, but I haven't used it recently, so I'm going to use it again for the new listeners. So for those that don't know, I my last job here was a startup, and the startup was acquired by a larger company. But when we were still a startup, it was interesting to see, like going back to the origins of the show, when we started the show, that this never probably would have been in consideration. But then 3-4 years into this show, the company I worked for didn't run a single internal server. Everything was public cloud. Everything was SaaS based. All of our HR, all of our office utilities, everything that you could possibly have was SaaS based, because we just basically we were a startup. We pulled out a credit card, and that's how we got going. And now looking back, I can't imagine any company not doing that to get started. And what's interesting there too is if you abstract that even one level up, you get this concept of public cloud is another tool in the toolbox. I think you had mentioned it actually when you did the serverless podcast with Chris Wall and those guys. You kind of position serverless as another tool in the toolbox, just like containers, just like VMs. And I would actually say public cloud in general is another tool in the toolbox. You know, it used to be just on-prem physical servers, and then we got into virtual machines. But then we really kind of reached this point where IT and ops, if I use that term in parentheses, they're kind of forked, right? And you no longer have just one general path. You now have all these different paths. And when we started this show, ops was, are you a compute guy? Are you a networking person? Are you a storage person?
Right.
And you could be really good at one. Maybe you were good at two. Very few people on the planet were good at all three. Well, now you have 5 to 10 disciplines and operations where folks can study a specific area. It's, public cloud in this sense. You could study that. You could take AWS and just the, massive amounts of AWS services, become an expert in just AWS public cloud. And, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't start to see this more and more going forward of, the IT folks or the ops folks really starting to actually specialize more and more. And that AWS specialist isn't just, say, a developer on staff who got some things spun up very quickly, because as things get more complex and just, you look at the AWS conference this year, the massive number of people that were there and the massive number of services, and even folks at AWS can't even necessarily keep up with all the services they offer anymore. So I definitely see that as a huge trend going forward, and something that kind of, I admit, kind of snuck up on me over the years, but it was just a natural evolution, if you will, of operations.
Right. Yeah, and we've got a few things. There was an interesting article. I think it was sort of a statement. We'll get towards the end of the show, but another thing we should sort of look at now that we are, if we sort of benchmark everything against AWS from a timeline perspective, just if we're sort of talking about the public cloud, AWS now being 10 years old, let's say Salesforce, for example, being like 15 years old. Everything in IT and technology tends to sort of have this yin and yang to it, right? So for the most part, if you boil it down, it's sort of like it becomes centralized, then it eventually sort of decentralizes and gets distributed, and then eventually it comes back to being centralized, and it gets into these, sometimes it's use cases and where users are, and then sometimes it's how manageable is it to deal with. It was interesting here at the end of the year, there was some major VCs who were starting to say, hey, we think the trend is becoming more decentralized, and because of IoT and cars. So maybe we'll get to that towards the end of the show, but it's another big trend for us to sort of start to keep an eye on. It's probably a longer term type of thing.
Yeah, completely.
So let's break down a few of these public clouds, because I think we sort of acknowledge that there are becoming a couple of really big players, like there always is in IT. Back in the day, it was the four horsemen of like EMC, Cisco, Intel, and Sun, and Oracle. We're starting to see the big players sort of emerge from a public cloud perspective. I think you could say it's Amazon, Azure, Google, Salesforce. Just in terms of people that either have massive footprint or massive, starting to see larger revenues. So let's start with AWS. You were at AWS reInvent. We didn't really have a chance to talk a whole lot about your perspectives on that. Where do you see AWS in the world today? What's its role in sort of global IT?
Well, so the number one thing is, they're the top. Anybody who considers public cloud, they're at the top of the list.
Yeah.
They are the number one top of mind public cloud vendor out there. So everyone's considering them. And the perception very much is low friction, super easy to get started. But then, the number one thing I'm starting to hear, though, is expensive at scale. And I completely admit this stat could be 1,000% incorrect, but I thought it was pretty fascinating. So anybody who was at the show, they introduced the snowmobile, which is a big, huge truck they brought on stage, and you could put a bunch of data in it, and they hook it up to your data center, put a bunch of data in it, and go pump it into AWS, right? And I forget how many petabytes the darn thing is, but somebody put up the stat there of, yeah, of course they're going to do something like that because, getting that much data there would take forever. And oh, by the way, it would cost like $75,000 a month if you were to ever actually move that maximum amount of capacity into their cloud.
Right.
So of course those trucks would pay for themselves very quickly at that rate. But what's interesting there is just, again, it's all about the services. They have moved up level, and they've moved up level a lot faster than anyone else. And I think they've done a great job of really positioning themselves longer term to even protect themselves from the other public cloud folks. When you see things like Lambda, and you see like especially the green grass and the IoT, and you're starting to see this, they're really starting to focus on this idea of an IoT front end with a serverless Lambda based back end. I mean, a lot of the announcements were around that. And of course, there's a lot of other things going on as well. But they're all about how much data can I get as quickly as possible? Because, to go back to a friend of the show, Dave McCurry, the data gravity concept, it's a data grab at this point.
Yeah.
And they're trying to get as much data in as quickly as possible. And if the pipe isn't big enough, fine. We'll ship a truck to you.
Yeah. It was interesting. When I was watching their keynote, and I having done some keynotes for various people in the past, I kind of take an interest in that stuff. I was joking to somebody. I said, watching Andy Jassy, kind of give the keynote with all the layers of the services and all this sort of stuff. I said it's basically, he's giving the EMC Federation talk, except they have one sales force instead of four. And it's kind of like they've become a one-stop shop for things. We talked to a guy named Joe Kinsella from Cloud Health last week, and he was talking about the show, and he said, the thing that was really interesting was it was sort of this big increase in the number of sort of suits, customers wearing suits, which was, at least in his opinion, kind of a lot of business people now going, I better go figure out what's there, and I got to be kicking the tires, and I got to be, kind of seeing what projects could get started, which sort of tells me, hey, even though people are enamored with them doing $10 or $11 billion or whatever they're at, sort of run rate they're at, it is the beginning of sort of this next trend, right? It's public cloud has been around for 10 plus years now, or however many years. But the trend of spending in the public cloud, I think, is just starting to begin. We're starting to see the real kind of enterprise uptick in that. So I think that's a big deal. The other thing is people always...
Let me add something to that real quick, though, too. So I have been to every reInvent so far.
Yep.
And it's interesting, too, to watch that show go from 4,000 folks to, 32,000 folks in just, 4 or 5 years. And what's also interesting is the focus of it. Again, going back to the focus of the keynotes was, in the early days was super startup, super, enterprises doing it wrong,
right?
Super all of that. Now they've gone to a much, I'd say, softer message at times. On that, they acknowledge the enterprise and the challenges, and they acknowledge that the biggest thing they're fighting is status quo. But then also to give you for instance, it wasn't on the agenda, was kind of I wouldn't say low key, but there was actually an executive summit there, if you will, where it was like C-levels and up kind of thing, and it was on the very top floor of the Venetian and super guarded, needed a special pass to get in. They had an entire executive track that lasted the entire week.
Yeah.
So not just, hoodies anymore at the show by any means.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's, like something like that is in essence one of the Gartner conferences, except at AWS, right? It's, hey, we bring a bunch of the executives in, we let the executives hobnob with each other and network with each other, which is, sort of what one of the Gartner conferences typically does. And then, you had an interesting statement from Adrian Cockcroft during one of the keynotes where, part of the keynote is always, hey, what's new? And then part of the keynote is, hey, who are they going to kill off this year? right? And the best way to, and unfortunately, the best way to, so here's our Cloudcast advice to anybody. If you want to ensure that you're not going to get killed off, don't be a diamond or platinum sponsor, because those people are always getting killed off. Like it's unfortunate, but if you go back through the years, like they've killed off lots of those, because in essence, it's places that are making money. If you're making enough money to become a diamond or platinum sponsor. But it was interesting. Adrian made this statement because somebody was like, "Oh, hey, look, AWS just killed off another partner because they introduced some, basically IT ops function as a AWS service." And Adrian made this interesting comment. He said, maybe you should stop going to start up a company and going to VCs for funding. You should just come to AWS and build that service instead, and avoid having to do marketing and having to, go through the startup thing. So it is interesting that if you think about the ecosystem that existed around, sort of what does Andy Jassy call it, like old guard IT, where CIOs used to go was its own independent thing. Now that's starting to start to get sucked into reInvent. The whole VC ecosystem, AWS is starting to hint around like, hey, don't go build that next monitoring tool startup or, whatever startup. Just come work at AWS and be your own team and do their own thing. And it does become an interesting, you think about people who have a background in things like the Porter 5 Forces, and you think about supply chain of technology. They're following the AWS model of go take in all of the aspects of it and make it a one-stop shop. The one thing that I think is interesting though, is 10 years in, everybody is still sort of enamored with the features and the new things that AWS comes out with. But they are starting to run into the challenge that every large technology company runs into, which is like, you have so many features and you have so much that you have to offer that it does become much more difficult to try and cohesively explain that to people, because you do have so many different buyers, right? This is no longer, like you said, just startup developers and a few different services. I mean, you're talking about, dozens and dozens of services across a bunch of buying centers, whether it's infrastructure, data and compliance and security, or whether it's, machine learning and your data scientists. And, that becomes difficult. Maybe not so much to develop, because AWS does a really good job of kind of isolating these services and then making them reachable via an API. But it will be interesting to see as they go really into the enterprise, like who's in the meeting that you have? How do you focus what the value of that is? It is no longer about just replace your data center and it's cheaper. It's got to be more focused around different areas that people care about. Yep.
How do you feel about kind of moving on here? How do you feel about Azure these days? What's your thoughts on Azure?
So I think the Azure thing, and I'm never sure if it's Azure or Azure. I think I always say
that's true.
I think I always say Azure. I think you kind of can't separate the Azure thing from kind of the new trend with Microsoft, right? So I think if you had said, hey, I don't know, 5 years ago when we were starting, or just even 3 or 4 years ago, like, hey, Microsoft's going to have a cloud, you kind of would have inherently said back in the Steve Ballmer days, okay, it'll all be Windows centric. It'll probably have a lot of proprietary stuff. It'll be the equivalent of Windows in the cloud, right? Sort of proprietary APIs, proprietary SDKs, for a certain kind of, only in the Windows ecosystem. And that's kind of gotten completely blown up with Satya Nadella. And I think we've mentioned that a number of times. I mean, he's really reshaping what they do. I think the biggest thing with them is I think they're following the Microsoft trend, which is, for the most part, they're a fast follower. They're not necessarily kind of the first with certain trends. So whether it's serverless or whether it's, machine learning, or you could argue like, hey, they used to have machine learning, way back in the day, but it never got marketed right. But they are a very fast follower for AWS. And I think the big trend that I hear in the marketplace is, enterprises know them. Enterprises know Microsoft. They trust them. They have buying relationships with them. And they're very much at least a number 2 in people's consideration. And I think a lot of people are at least large corporations, mid-sized corporations, are going to give them the benefit of the doubt first, more so than they might essentially AWS being almost like a new vendor on their buying list.
Yeah, and you bring up an amazing point there that needs to probably be talked about even a little further, and that is the buying relationships aspect of all of that. Of both of us having worked for vendors or partners over the years, how things get sold into an enterprise. And, let's be honest, that's where the vast majority of the money is in the enterprise. Microsoft has, relationships. They have account reps, they have client reps, they have SEs, they have all of these, ways to get into enterprise accounts where they've already been doing business on-prem for years. And so, at the end of the day, they have the most complete vision, if you will, or probably the best ability to pull off an on-prem to public cloud vision with Azure Stack and this ability to bridge traditional IT and being this fast follower model, as opposed to Amazon being out in front and it's, public cloud or nothing. And you're starting to see in AWS, like the green grass stuff I actually got to see a demo of that. And that was really, really cool, the way they kind of did the on-prem stuff. And so you're starting to see them make some things there, but they're doing it in their own way in the IoT area specifically. And Microsoft really taking this traditional IT and how do we make it fit into a public cloud world? And the number one way you have to do it is, of course, effectively containerize all of your IT operations, and that's what Azure Stack should be when it's released. And hopefully we'll get the guys back on the show to talk about it some more, but you have to standardize it before you can move it.
Right.
And so, but that again, going back to that, if anybody has the ability to go tap the enterprise, whether it's Google, AWS, or Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft is way ahead of the others when it just comes to that ability to tap into enterprise funds.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit in the context of, so if we put it in the context of the bulk of the money today. So let's put this in perspective just for dollars and cents. So let's say Amazon or AWS is going to do, I don't know, 12 billion, 13 billion, something this year, and maybe it's 15 billion, who knows. But and then Azure, at least the part that people can break out is, I don't know, a couple of $1 billion, if I remember back to my Wikibon days when we used to try and break stuff out. So let's say just best case scenario, it's like 3 billion and AWS is 15 billion, and those numbers might be a little high, but let's say it's about 5 to 1 roughly in terms of revenue. Either one of those numbers is kind of, I don't want to say irrelevant, but it is in the bigger picture of the spend of enterprise IT pretty small, which is, still I don't know, depending on the number you talk about, 600 billion to, $1 trillion in typical IT spend a year, right? So
so not even 1%.
Yeah, it's small. It's still very small. And people will argue
a couple percent.
Yeah, people will argue like for every dollar that gets replaced in the cloud, it's $2 or $3, whatever. It's still not enormous, right? So, just putting that in a timeline perspective for people are dollars and cents. So the real context of the whole thing for, say, somebody like Microsoft or AWS is, do I make investments just in the public cloud, which is what AWS has done for a long time? Do I have to do some sort of on-prem, off-prem type of thing, which is where we're starting to see this happen? And it's interesting to me. This is one place I would sort of argue that I think Microsoft is still not right. I'm personally not a huge fan of the Azure Stack approach, and here's why. I think the idea of saying, everything that isn't in Azure today, you'll be able to run in your own data center is, I will be very surprised if they can pull that off. And I've heard various comments. I know we've had the guys from Microsoft on before, and they've sort of said, yeah, well, maybe not everything, because maybe not everything sort of makes sense. We sort of know people like Dell and HP are kind of building out these little, racks of equipment and stuff, which, that's a dozen servers or 24 servers or 4 servers or whatever. It's like, look, just the control plane alone, you're not going to get a whole lot of services on there. And the reason I bring this up is it's such a stark contrast. It is a very Windows-centric way of thinking about saying, like, put everything into a smaller form factor, but put it there. It's the equivalent of saying, like, put Windows onto a Windows phone and get the same experience. Whereas if you look at AWS, they're taking the very AWS way of doing it, which is like, give me a minimum viable product, which is like basically green grass, which is like a small snowball size footprint and one or two services. It's like S3 and Lambda, right, in a thing. And I'm going to go see if that fosters anything with people. And if it does, I can expand it and I can expand it. And if you think about it, you go, well, on one end of the spectrum, they've got Snowball, and on the other end, they've got Snowmobile, but they're only putting a couple services out there to see if people are gonna like them. And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch is, do you have to take the approach of everything has to be the same on-prem? Or can I take the approach of like, I'm going to give you a couple of services and kind of target a certain number of people on-prem to see if they like it? I think that's going to be a huge thing over the next couple of years between those two in terms of saying who moves more workloads or who controls more workloads between on-prem and off-prem.
Well, and you also have we haven't talked about them in a public cloud context, but in this instance, probably a spoiler to Microsoft. You have the Dell EMC VMware convergence, if you will. And if anybody is going to go build the equivalent of an Azure stack, it's potentially them, right? And I have no knowledge of what's going on over there. I just kind of read the register and the headlines on Twitter and all of that. But it makes perfect sense that, you know, the Cisco relationship and the VCE relationship is kind of going sour quickly over all of that, at least according to the press. And then you have that coming up. And if anybody also has, their roots in the enterprise and in relationships in the enterprise and could countersell, if you will, against Azure stack, even though they'll come out with some kind of product just in case, it's going to be them.
Yeah.
So Azure is really getting it from both sides. They're getting it from the public cloud side, and they're getting it from the traditional converged infrastructure side. Yeah,
and that's normal. I mean, they've always fought a multi-war, multi-vendor battle. So I don't think they're unaccustomed to that. Some companies, the smaller startup companies, struggle when they have to compete against multiple at the same time. I don't know that Microsoft will. And I say that I don't know that they'll struggle as much because they still have the Office cash cow to sort of, help them get through a lot of things. And from everything we can tell, Office 365, and all of the online stuff continues to grow. And it's still their biggest public cloud offering at this point. We'll see what happens with LinkedIn and what they can do with all that sort of interesting stuff from that acquisition. But, that's the Azure thing. Yeah, I think the Azure thing is it's funny. People look at Azure as like, the great hope for the enterprise, as opposed to a decade ago when it was like, oh, it's the great lock-in. I hope I can get away from Microsoft. It's an interesting transition that happens in IT over the decades and stuff. So let's shift gears again. We don't talk a lot about the Google Cloud on here. We do from time to time. Where do you see Google in all this stuff?
Well, so here's the one big thing I'd say about them in summary. Like, if machine learning really ever takes over, they win hands down. And also, of course, they've got Kubernetes kind of back in everything, and Kubernetes is the new hotness. And so, if Azure has the super easy on-prem to public cloud vision, the Kubernetes on-prem to public cloud vision could play out long-term. But again, you're fighting status quo of everyone rewriting their apps and everyone kind of doing things differently and thinking differently. And Kubernetes, depending on who you talk to, is either, really, really easy to use and really awesome, or really, really complex and really freaking hard. You get varying opinions on Kubernetes. But the biggest thing I would say, though, with them is, the Google Cloud was at GCP Next conference this year, or in 2016. Was it back in March, maybe? And didn't you go to that, Brian?
Yeah, I did.
And that was the first time it kind of hit my radar. And then I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool conference. And they're announcing some neat things. And so for me, more than anything else, 2016 was the year where I actually really started to pay attention to them. And maybe it's just because I have maybe a bias towards Google of, I'm like, oh, they have a cloud. Well, they'll probably play with it a little bit and then they'll probably, decide to kill it. And like, I just never really got over it just felt like another Google beta product. But it feels like they're making a go of it. They're doing some really cool things there. They've got some pretty neat services that they've announced this year. And if anything else, they certainly have the money that they could fund it at a loss for as long as it takes to become a player there. So they probably have a ton of potential, and I'm paying attention to them. But at the same time, other than some kind of use cases, and I actually listened to the GCP podcast, and they do some really amazing case studies on there as well. But it definitely feels like AWS a couple of years ago. When it comes to like the level of services and the case studies, and it seems like who they're going after. And as it's almost like a natural evolution of a public cloud company. You go from, minimum viable products, limited amount of services, going after the startup companies, basically competing with AWS in the old days. And then you kind of have to move into the revenue streams, and you move from the startups into the, eventually the enterprise. And in order to get to the enterprise, you have to have those big relationships. You have to have a lot of services. You have to have a big portfolio. And quite frankly, you have to have cook time. The service has to be there and be reliable for a number of years before anyone will even consider it or trust it. And so more than anything else, I would say this year was the year that they kind of came into their own of being, in the level of AWS and Azure. Yeah,
it's the Google Cloud is an interesting thing because on one hand, if you look at people that benchmark things and you look at some of the just purely technology, it's like they have a noticeably faster network. So some of the things about getting data in and out of it should be less of a burden. So they have a better, faster network in terms of global. They have noticeably, at least for people that benchmark it, like faster compute. Better type like so like. The network's better, the compute's better. The pricing is really innovative in that it lowers itself the more you use it. So, that concern about like, hey, it gets more expensive at scale, like I think becomes sort of less of an issue with Google. So it's like, in theory, it's cheaper than some of the other ones. And so you look at some of those things and you start to go like, all those natural inclinations of how people buy stuff, like, somewhat better technology, faster, cheaper, like those really aren't playing out that well. Right. And you go, well, why is that happening? And you kind of go, okay, well, let's look at the flip side of it. Google doesn't market themselves very well. Typically, they don't really have anybody running it. I mean, Diane Green is now there from VMware, and every storyline I ever read about Diane Green is, everybody goes, hey, did you know that Diane Green used to run VMware? Did you know that she used to have enterprise chops? And she's probably going to be able to figure out how to, as a single person, change the culture at Google. And you go, yeah, how often does that happen, right? That one individual is going to change the culture of something. And then I think Google, but on the flip side, it's like you said, if the world, or if a large chunk of companies say, hey, look, things like machine learning, things like AI, things like those things are a big part of what we do in our business, whether it's predicting pricing for markets, whether it's predicting weather, whether it's trying to provide better customer service. Like you almost wonder if Google shouldn't not spend a whole lot of time talking about things like, VMs and storage and stuff, and just almost entirely focus on that thing that they're sort of unique and differentiated on, which is machine learning, lots and lots of data, all the stuff that they do incredibly, incredibly well, and not try and fight at the lower levels with the Azures. And I don't know if you can do that. I don't know if the cloud is such a game that if you're in IaaS, if you're in higher level services, you also have to be in IaaS, or if you could skip that if you were really good at the other stuff. And, I think that's the dilemma that Google has. And then, like you mentioned, they will forever, at least with techies, have the is this thing in beta? Does it go away like Google Reader kind of problem? And I've talked to Google people about that, and they go, "That's a Google problem. That's not a Google Cloud problem. It's not our fault." And you go, "You're all called Google," and it's unfortunate. And it is what it is. I mean, it's like you hate to sort of burden somebody with their past, but it's like you've got to figure out a way to get over that. And you talked about that, right? You've got to bake things in, and but I think that's Google's thing is it's great technology. We've always known Google has great technology, but what is it, and where do they want it to be? And I think that's their challenge to go figure out. Like, we sort of know where AWS wants to be. We know where Azure generally wants to be. I don't think we really know where Google wants to be. And you hear different opinions, and we've tried to get Google people come on before, and we may make that happen in 2017. But Diane Green is not a personality who loves to be in the spotlight. She's very good at what she does, but she's not like, I don't know who the face of Google Cloud is, if you put it that way, right? And maybe that they need that. I don't know. So we started to talk about the big three. We said, we shouldn't be so focused on the infrastructure stuff, but yet we talked about the big three sort of infrastructure clouds, even though we talked about some of the higher level services. If you're somebody listening to the show, and thankfully we've had a lot of new listeners this year, what are the areas for you that you're seeing emerging in the public cloud in every form or any form that you think people need to sort of start paying attention to, maybe more so than they have in the last few years?
Well, probably the biggest thing that I've seen when it comes to, what do we need to pay attention going forward is actually something as simple as not technology at all. It's the data sovereignty and the kind of the local politics of everything. And it's more specifically around, where does data get placed? That seems to be, and that's why, you see these AWS regions just popping up all over the place, and all these new availability zones. And it seems to be the number one thing, because, at a certain level, there was this fear of security once upon a time, and that's pretty much a solved technology at this point. And there was this fear of cost, and that's, and I'd say still evolving, but certainly, there are solutions out there. And so now it really comes down to simply, am I allowed to store my data where I want to store my data? That has been one of the biggest ones. And then, getting the data in and out, hence the snowmobile truck and some of these other things. The companies are going to need to be creative going forward to get the data, but it's basically all about the data going forward is the big trend that I'm seeing.
Yeah, no, I think it is sort of interesting. We're coming up on 2017, and you think about just sort of some of the geopolitics in the world, and kind of having dealt with different countries in Europe and their evolving standards, and how they're a little bit different, even though you have the EU, but each country's a little different. Or aspects of Asia, like everyone sort of goes, well, Asia, China is very different than Russia, is very different than Thailand and Australia. And like, I'm still a little bit surprised when you talk about footprint that like there isn't a major AWS cloud presence or an Azure cloud in most of the major, even European centers, right? Like they're in London, but like there's not necessarily one in Paris. There's not necessarily one there, like sometimes there's one in Germany, but maybe it's not owned by them. There's not one in Spain. There's not one in, mostly the Middle East at all. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of surprising to me that we've gotten that far, and given what people like Equinix can do, and that there isn't sort of global, in-country presence, which is sort of interesting. I think, and we don't cover this at all on the show. We do occasionally. Data's the flip side of data, of munging data, managing data, extracting information from data, I think is the other big thing. Whether you call that machine learning, AI, data science, big data, more and more, we haven't covered it as much because there wasn't as much sort of enterprise data in the cloud. I think we're going to see more and more that becomes a thing, right? So it's, it used to be follow the money. It's going to become follow the data, because follow the data will follow the money. That's going to be an interesting sort of trend to watch as well. And then I think the third thing, staying in this data theme, and I hinted on it at the beginning of the show. You look at where some of these trends are going, like IoT or autonomous vehicles or, whatever that is. People are now starting to say, hey, what if the data doesn't get up into the public cloud? What if it stays in your vehicle? What if it stays in a sensor out on a streetlight somewhere or in a wind tower or, that's going to make it interesting because you do have lots of the world where, the cellular data costs are extremely expensive. Data isn't, internet access isn't readily available or it's not fast enough. That's going to be another interesting sort of trend of like, where is the edge of the cloud? Is it a CDN network? Is it a vehicle? Is it, wherever?
Yeah. And to take it even one step further. So, the other kind of big trend, if you will, that really kind of came to the forefront, it was the machine learning, but more specifically, the voice machine learning through Siri, OK Google, and the A word. And the reason I'm not saying the A word is because my Echo Dot is sitting on my desk and I don't want to wake her up. Yep. But it's really fascinating how something as simple as that. So a lot of people, when they think machine learning, they do think, big data warehousing and like the Target story of, putting all the data in there and then doing targeting ads and some of these other things. But it is something as simple as, getting your flash briefing or getting the weather and understanding accents and how people ask questions and the concept of just giving people the data they want and being able to just, pick up your phone or just talk into the air. That is just a huge trend going forward. And that one, it seems to have been, especially with Amazon, the Amazon products kind of coming into being this year. And then, the holiday season in 2016 was definitely all about those products in general.
Yep.
That seems to be the big fight going forward. And that's probably going to be, a large topic on our prediction show that we're going to do here in a couple of days.
Yeah, definitely. It's you're already hearing people say like that's becoming the new interface. It's it'll be in your vehicle, it'll be in your house, it'll be and it's the one natural thing that everybody sort of possesses without device or whatever. So, we'll sort of wrap this up because the show's going quite long. As always, we can't cover every topic in a big space like this. But so 2016 was a weird year. We lost some people. We lost a lot of artists. We lost George Michael and David Bowie and Prince and some others. But we also lost some clouds.
Yes, we did.
To me, 2016 was the year that. If you were a hardware company and you thought you were going to be in the cloud business, or like you were an IT infrastructure company and you had at some point had plans to be in the cloud business, those probably didn't end well, especially this year.
Yeah, well, and I would, we'll go back and listen to our Simon Wardley shows, but Simon Wardley was right. It takes billions to play in this game, and the big few already won. And you'll notice too. So if we mention Oracle, if we mention VMware, if we mention HPE, we mention Cisco, what have they all done? They've all tossed in the towel for the most part. Maybe not Oracle, but all the rest of them have kind of tossed in the towel when it comes to clouds. The only one that wasn't, remember a couple of years ago when everyone was like $1 billion. IBM's investing $1 billion. Cisco is investing $1 billion. IBM is the only one that hasn't publicly thrown in the towel, but you also, notice we didn't talk about them in one of the big players. And so I think it's them. They might always be a distant fourth, if you will. They might not ever completely throw in the towel because if anybody has money to make a go of it, it's probably them. But yes, from a public cloud perspective, this was the year all of the other vendors went, we're a hardware company. Public cloud is really hard.
Yeah. Well, and even people like Rackspace who, forever had owned their own facilities sort of said, you know what, we're gonna shift more of a focus towards, fanatical service managing other people's basically, where your resources run. So if they want to run on AWS, that's great. We'll manage that for you, or Azure or something like that. So, it is interesting. The $1 billion comment was interesting because at the time the Cisco's and IBM's were saying we're making $1 billion investment, we were already saying it's $1 billion a quarter for the Azures and the cost to play in the game at that point was $1 billion a quarter. And they were talking about $1 billion as sort of like their overall investment over a couple of years. And it was like, okay, you're already way too far behind. And, it is interesting that Oracle keeps trying to make a play at this, and they make a lot of announcements, and then you don't hear anything about them for the rest of the year. And then Oracle Open World will roll around again the next year, and they'll say, hey, we're relevant again for a week, and then they kind of go away. And for them, it is weird because of the massive cash cow that Oracle is, and as competitive as they are. But they just, I think they're doing well in SaaS, and they just bought NetSuite, and there's talk of them buying Pegasystems and some other things that plays to them being an application provider. It is still weird to me that they have this fascination with Amazon and wanting to be in the IaaS business, which I don't quite understand.
Yeah, no, completely.
Well, listen, man, let's wrap this up a little bit. So like we said, this is going to be sort of our state of the public cloud. What sort of grade would you give the public cloud as a whole at this point, and where do you expect it to be in 2017?
I'd say, I give it a B or an 80% right now, in the fact that probably a year ago, I would have given a lot less because I felt like the execution wasn't quite there, and the market was still kind of muddy and still had a lot of players in it. But the market itself has pretty well solidified into who are the players and how are they differentiating themselves. So I think that's really good. But I do think there is still a number of challenges when it comes to how does an enterprise get up to speed? How does an enterprise potentially either run their apps or rewrite their apps? And so I think it really comes down to like the infrastructure is baked and the product set is baked, but how does an enterprise execute on that vision to get there, and also how do they do that in a cost-effective manner, I think is the next big thing. So, and it's nice because when you think about it, we've moved from a technology problem to a business operations problem.
Yeah.
And so I think that is going to be the focus going forward. And again, it goes to like AWS announcing that big consulting thing and some of these others. It's going to take services like that to really be the next big step. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what grade to give it. I think there's parts of it that you'd say, hey, it's an A or close to an A, like SaaS services are really easy to use and the UIs are pretty easy. And, you look at the portfolio of certain things like AWS and Azure and you're like, wow, they're pretty robust. But I think if I really kind of step back from it, it's like, it's still complicated to price, which is normal for IT. Like IT was never easy to price, but like the public cloud hasn't necessarily made kind of long-term understanding the pricing a lot simpler. So I think there's a lot of work there. It's still difficult to get an application into the cloud. And, we're 7 years into this thing. Pardon my French. Is that something that people should care about? Like, should we stop talking about moving things to the cloud? Or if moving things to the cloud is a reality, I would give that a pretty low grade. Because it is very difficult to do, and bandwidth is still a challenge, and shifting architectures is a challenge. I think the future of where computing is going. Obviously, I think there's no doubt that it's public cloud. I don't buy into the people who always go, yeah, but mainframe didn't go away. It's like, yeah, I'm sure I can find somebody with a VCR laying around their house too. Or, I have a 1994 pickup truck sitting in my driveway, but that doesn't mean that the future of cars is going to be, old pickup trucks just because they haven't gone away. I think we're both very bullish on it. I think what's really ultimately interesting to me is, this isn't a shift like, minis to PCs or PCs to mobile, because I think in that case, it was still, you bought them in a certain way and you interact with them in a certain way. I think the rules around public cloud are so different. Like the game, the supply chain, what the ecosystem looks like is so different. I still don't think people totally grasp what that is. And I think if you go back and listen to some of the Simon Wardley stuff, we used to always scratch our head and go, this guy's crazy. I don't quite understand it. I think he got part of it. but I still don't think people totally grasp how much change is going to happen. I think that'll be a big thing that the people need to sort of wrap their head around. Like, put yourself in the position of saying like, hey, if everything went public cloud, whether you believe it or not, like, what would you do? And I think that's the big question to start to ask yourself in 2017 is if that shift happens faster than you expect, where will you be, and will you have made the right decisions and so forth. So anyways, with that long rant, let's wrap it up for today. Like I said, we're going to do the predictions and end of year wrap up show. And there's a whole bunch of announcements we're going to make around the show tomorrow. I think we're going to do it tomorrow. So anyways, folks, thanks for listening as always. Thanks to everybody who's new to the show. Thanks to everybody who tells a friend. By the way, we're still cool with you guys giving us reviews on iTunes, good or bad. Still love feedback from everybody. And with that, we are going to wrap it up, and everybody have a good, happy new year, and we will talk to you soon.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.